In the summer of 1915, a new film was scheduled to debut in Portland. It was called The Birth of a Nation and billed as an historical drama of the Civil War. Audiences around the country had already given it rave reviews.
The film, created by D.W. Griffith, was the first blockbuster film in a brand new industry. It was a film in which blacks were portrayed in the most negative ways, with all the old stereotypes, and blacks were portrayed as the danger to the success and the continuation of American civilization.
It glorified the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It perpetuated the myth of African Americans as being lazy, perpetuated the myth that African American men wanted to rape white women. It was just seen as very counterproductive to the push for race relations that was going on at that time.
As citizens of Portland, we must protest. The Birth of a Nation contains scenes untrue in history, misleading and revolting. The whole play is a diabolical scheme of wrong impressions.
26-year-old Beatrice Morrow Cannady was an African American living in Portland. She was already a well-known civil rights activist and had helped found the Portland chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, a year earlier.
Cannady mounted a protest. She used the NAACP, she contacted the mayor, she sent a petition to the governor. She just tried to get the film banned.
It wasn't just about a movie. It was really a defining moment in her racial philosophy of progress that made it necessary for her to organize and to resist and to respond to a movie like Birth of a Nation.
Cannady helped lead a generation of protest. She envisioned a town where everyone was equal and would spend the next 20 years working to improve conditions for African Americans.
She was someone who was on purpose. She was on a mission.
Her big mission was to try to educate people, to let them know about African Americans who wrote poetry, who had fought in, the wars, who had musical careers like Roland Hayes, who were politicians, who had done something to contribute to the United States.
She was called the ambassador of interracial goodwill.
American society said that there's a color line and people don't cross it. But she said that's not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. And so the career of a person like Beatrice is a perfect opportunity for us to begin to understand the true history of her generation, a history that included a powerful black woman in a black community that was cohesive and a dynamic part of Portland life in the 20th century.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Ann and Bill Swindell's Charitable Trust, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and from viewers like you. Thank you.
It seems that way out here in Oregon, God's country, there should not be any such thing as race antipathy. But there is, and lots of it.
In the early part of the 20th century, Portland, Oregon bustled with activity. 250,000 people lived and worked there, but few African Americans called it home.
Oregon was founded in the generation right before the American Civil War, and the strategy to try and deal with the racial issues of their generation was one of avoidance. They made the Oregon experience an anti-slavery experience, but they also made it an anti-black experience.
In 1859, Oregon became the first state in the Union with black exclusion laws in its constitution.
Blacks would not be allowed to migrate to Oregon. Blacks would not be allowed to own property here, would not be allowed to engage in business activities in Oregon.
After the Civil War, amendments to the U.S. Constitution technically voided Oregon's exclusion laws, but the state remained hostile to blacks. African Americans who came found work in the railroad industry or in hotels, but little else.
It was not unlawful to segregate people or to discriminate against people or to refuse to deal with people because of their race. That was the norm.
A black person who came to Oregon could not expect to stay in a white hotel or eat in a white restaurant. And although that was restrictive and destructive in many ways, it created opportunities for people in the black community to provide those services.
African American-owned businesses thrived.
Institutions like the Golden West Hotel and the various black churches that were created in this time period were places that were really the glue that held the black population in the area together. And so when Beatrice would come to Oregon in the early 20th century, she would come to that kind of established and somewhat stable black community, small in size, small in numbers, but in many ways a coherent black community.
Beatrice Hulan Morrow was a native Texan born in 1889. At an early age, she was outgoing, fashionable, and strong-willed. Her grandparents were former slaves and provided a strong family foundation.
Her family, her parents really stressed education. She and her siblings all went to college. They all became professionals. She went to the University of Chicago to study voice and piano, which were her absolute first passions in life. She really wanted to be an opera singer.
But a long-distance courtship changed her life.
I had never met Edward Kennedy before, but I had been encouraged by friends to exchange purely platonic letters with him. And in 1912, I purchased a train ticket to visit him in the West.
And the story goes that when she arrived here, she decided to stay and she cashed in her return ticket, and they were married in June of 1912.
Edward Kennedy was the hat check man at the Portland Hotel and co-founder and publisher of a weekly African-American newspaper called The Advocate. Beatrice, not content to stay at home, quickly became associate editor.
And I think that she became very enthralled with the idea that she could make a difference. She had no journalism experience, but she just dove right in and really took over most of the responsibility for running the newspaper. She had her hand in everything. She ran the linotype, she wrote editorials, she wrote news stories, feature stories. The Advocate really was a lifeline to the African-American community in Portland. It was just jam-packed with information.
The Advocate became the only black newspaper in town and an alternative to the mainstream white press.
If you read the Sunday newspaper, if you opened the comic strips, you would see black people present there, but they would always be in the form of the old black mammy or the black Sambo.
They make it appear that the most intelligent man or woman, with few exceptions, uses ridiculous English.
Part of her educational tactic was to inform white editors that they were, again, stereotyping by the use of dialect. The same thing with using a lowercase n for Negro or using epithets such as negress or buck. She just felt that that was not helping the situation. It was not helping interracial relations. In fact, it was, detracting from her work that she was trying to do.
And when the white papers were never saying anything good about black people, her publication provided an avenue that rounded out the picture.
Charlotte Rutherford grew up in a house of activism. In the 1950s, her parents, Otto and Verdell, were the president and secretary of the NAACP in Portland. They saved old copies of The Advocate and articles about Kennedy.
She highlighted businesses and home ownership all the time, providing information showing progress, if you will, that black people were making was one of her primary motives.
When a fellow boosts his own town, he does not stop there. He is performing an act that improves his own condition.
The Advocate really gave that sense of a growing community with African American businesses, culture, religion, education, students achieving, people achieving, births, deaths, the whole thing that goes into making a community.
She was certainly aware of the hostile circumstances and negative circumstances that any black person had to endure, but she also would have been aware of the potential for improvement. She understood that if the black population became larger, it became more powerful.
In 1915, the black population in Portland mobilized against a powerful new film. But despite the protest, The Birth of a Nation played to sellout crowds. The film returned 3 years later. Another attempt to ban it failed.
She took it extremely personally. According to the Morning Oregonian article, she actually broke down and wept.
People say that the campaign against Birth of a Nation was unsuccessful because the movie was shown, in spite of the protests, in spite of the attempts by blacks to get it banned. But that's really not the point. The point is that blacks were able to mount that kind of protest, and that had never occurred in Portland before. And that was a tremendous victory.
The victory was possible because of the newly created NAACP, a vehicle for organized protest.
They created that essential element that would allow racial progress to occur in later years of the 20th century.
Using their collective voice, Cannady and other community leaders crafted Oregon's first public accommodations law in 1919.
She was one of 3 people, 3 voices invited to the legislature to speak on behalf of the bill. It was not a welcoming environment. In fact, at the time, there was controversy about whether she or the group should even be allowed to speak, but she did use her voice. The bill did not pass, but clearly she was one who had her eyes focused on the prize.
Even at her darkest moments, there was always hope that maybe things would get better, maybe things would improve, and I think that that's what kept her going year after year.
And I think as we look at her career, we can see the kind of energy that's required to achieve even those small victories.
In the 1920s, the road to social equality was slow. Cannady knew she needed every professional advantage. While raising 2 small sons, she enrolled in Portland's Northwestern College of Law and became the first African-American woman to practice law in Oregon. But graduation night would be bittersweet.
She received her diploma and was asked to sing 2 songs. She was absolutely thrilled to be able to provide the entertainment at Multnomah Hotel. And after that, the president of the college asked her and her brother to leave.
For the first time during the whole course of study, I was reminded of my color. Of course, I do not forget such experiences, and no one can fully appreciate the distress unless they have suffered in the same way.
Cannady rarely wrote about personal experiences with discrimination, but when it touched her family, she did.
One night, she had tickets for her and her sons George and Ivan to attend a performance at the Oriental Theater. And when they got there, apparently the usher tried to seat them in the balcony, and Cannady was just incensed. She ended up writing about the incident in sort of a 3-part play.
Guest, haven't you any seats downstairs? Usher, yes, but I'm sorry I can't seat your people downstairs. Guest, just what do you mean by your people? Usher, silence.
She ended up just basically telling the usher that she was going to sit wherever she darn well pleased.
Beatrice Cannady was bold. She was courageous. She was a woman warrior.
Over the years, Cannady would agitate, inflame, and educate all at the same time. She was unafraid to look her enemies squarely in the eye. In the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was parading through Salem and Portland, Eugene, and Coos Bay.
The Klan was the largest social organization in Oregon in the early 1920s. And they had tremendous power. They were able to elect a governor of Oregon in 1923.
In Grants Pass, a newspaper editor named William Green was writing thinly veiled copy.
Nigger, we don't want you here, and we won't have you here. You'd better roll up your bed and ride. This is to be a white man's country.
Cannady replied,
We do not say that this editor is not educated in the orthodox meaning of the term education, but there are plenty of educated fools who have missed the real purpose of education. History informs us, and let us suggest that history would help you too, that at one time in the past, red men inhabited those parts, so therefore, it could not have always been a white man's town.
Her comments sparked an editorial war lasting weeks.
The Advocate, through its associate niggerous editor with a Spitfire nigger attitude, has...
At one point, he called her a she-wizard, and she delighted in that title. She actually used it in her byline.
If the organization which he seems to represent is so noble and good, let us ask him why it is necessary for its members to wear diapers over their faces and do their work at night. If what the organization preaches and practices is right, why not uncover your faces and come out into the open?
With that, Cannady got the last word and attracted some national press as well. The Klan's influence in Oregon faded by the late 1920s. The state's hostility towards blacks did not.
Remember that segregation is the root of all evils, for when people do not know one another, they are suspicious and distrustful. Only by contact with the races will ever an understanding be reached.
Cannady embraced her role as Portland's ambassador of goodwill. Her calendar filled with speaking engagements, up to 100 a year. She spoke at churches, conferences, and schools.
She went to high schools as often as she could. Lincoln High School was a real favorite of hers.
Students were often asked to write essays in response.
Direct contact can do more to do away with misunderstandings.
After hearing Mrs. Cannady's address, I have changed my attitude toward the black race.
Reed College was another favorite destination. Invited by the president, she spoke in history classes and often in the college chapel.
She viewed it as her mission to educate people and just took that so seriously and would talk poignantly, eloquently, using facts and figures to demonstrate the progress that had been made since the Civil War and before.
But more than anything, Cannady wanted people to know each other as individuals.
We believe that in the homes, over a cup of tea, can these racial barriers be removed.
She invited people of all colors and creeds into her home.
We always see that the guests who already know each other do not corner off, but must meet and chat with those whom they meet for the first time.
I think the teas must have been fabulous affairs. She had up to 200 or more people there sometimes. You would have heard different languages. You would have heard different conversations about religion, different conversations about politics. Everybody would have been wearing their finest, including Beatrice Cannady. It was an opportunity for people to meet, to mingle, to have contact with one another that they might not have met before.
Cookies? Yes, thank you. You who have not beheld the sight of a Chinese, a Caucasian, a Negro, and Japanese woman sitting together at the same table, cutting ices and pouring tea, all the while chatting away like birds in a tree, have missed a sight in heaven.
She got a lot of publicity for it. A lot of people apparently emulated her teas, and she just enjoyed throwing them, for one thing.
Cannady took great pride in her personal library, too. She owned more than 300 volumes of African American history, poetry, and literature, and shared them at every opportunity.
She would have fireside chats in her home. White students and African American students were invited to come and sort of continue the conversations that she had had with them in schools. She just really thrived on being the teacher, trying to convert people, trying to help them see the light.
Focusing on our commonalities.
When Beatrice Cannady is crossing the color line in every direction imaginable and bringing people from different races and different cultures and different ethnic groups together in a social environment, in a personal environment, she is challenging all of the official policies of race in her generation. She's just not challenging private prejudice, she's challenging official racism. And for her to do that in that generation required courage. And it required commitment beyond that which most people in this generation can imagine.
Cannady fought social injustice with every available tool. And when Oregonians switched on their radios, she was there.
We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history.
Through the years, she became more and more popular. Used the opportunity to talk about art, culture, poetry, history, Negro health. She really, talked about anything and everything in order to, again, try to break down some of these stereotypes that people might have held.
As Cannady's influence in the community grew, not everyone was pleased. Critics charged her with rampant self-promotion and embellishing her role with the NAACP.
People felt that she was taking the limelight away from the organization, that other people were working for interracial relations too, but were not getting the credit that they deserved.
The fact that she was a powerful and an aggressive leader in the Black community was not always well received by some of the males of her generation. There were elements of competition, there were elements of hostility, and there were people in the Black community who had a certain degree of jealousy about the success and about the position of power and leadership that she was able to assume.
The animosity escalated when the NAACP decided to hold meetings in the new but segregated YWCA.
What a paradox. The NAACP, that great organization more than 200,000 strong, banded together to fight segregation, using as a meeting place a Jim Crow place. What a laughingstock for the enemies of the NAACP.
She did boycott it for a while. There was a sort of a tentative truce, but it really caused a rift in the African American community.
Beatrice was a woman of principle. So when her principles were challenged or violated, it didn't matter from which racial group or gender group that violation might come, she was going to be aggressive in opposing you.
Cannady's aggressive campaigns would bring her notoriety far beyond Portland. In 1927, the national offices of the NAACP invited her to participate in the 4th Pan-African Congress in New York.
It received press in the Black press, it received press in the white press, and caused, I think, a fair amount of pride in the African American community in Portland.
Energized by the experience, she unveiled an ambitious plan. She would organize a miniature Pan-African Congress in Portland.
And the resolutions that came from that were extremely important. The idea that, the Portland public schools needed to do more to educate their students. They needed to subscribe in their libraries to The Advocate. They needed to add books about Negro history, in the libraries.
2 years later, Beatrice Morrow Cannady was nominated for the National Harmon Award, given for distinguished accomplishments in the field of race relations.
I can only say that more than any other one person in the Great Northwest, Mrs. Cannady has interpreted the problems of her race.
She never talked about her disappointment in not winning the award, but the fact that white people in Portland were writing letters of recommendation on her behalf, acknowledging her efforts for the past 20 years was really remarkable. And I think that it really kind of boosted Cannady at a time when she needed some boosting herself.
In 1931, The Birth of a Nation returned to Portland.
The Birth of a Nation has been recast and comes out all dressed up as a talkie. It was vicious as a silent drama, but now that it talks, we are of the opinion that it is much more vicious.
Cannady mobilized one more time. On December 23rd, she encouraged her colleagues to attend a private viewing of the film and a special city council meeting the next day.
Just when it seemed inevitable that the Christmas spirit in Portland would be marred by the exhibition of the obnoxious film, the city fathers, colored people, the council of churches, and individuals got busy. and barred it from Portland picture houses.
After 16 years, the battle was over, for now, and Cannady had other business. Now divorced and remarried, she became the first African American to run for state office in Oregon.
She doesn't win, but she ran. She made a statement. And when I look at the life of Beatrice Cannady and what she stood for, and the fact that she was the first one to run, we're standing on her shoulders.
In 1936, Beatrice left Portland for Los Angeles and never returned. The Advocate ceased publication. The Birth of a Nation would be re-released. And Cannady never stopped promoting interracial harmony and goodwill.
Cooperation between the white and the black races, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, is one of the vital present-day needs if greater world harmony is to ensue.
If you define success as the continuing process of organization and commitment, and the continuing process of devoting time and energy to trying to achieve change, then you see it in abundance in her career and in her generation.
1953 brought a turning point in the struggle for racial justice. The Public Accommodations Law passed in Oregon. The NAACP led the fight to victory.
I think they were torn. On the one hand, they were very pleased that it was passed, and on the other hand, they were really disgusted that it took that long and that much effort.
In fact, it took 18 legislative sessions of patience and perseverance and intentional effort on the part of not only African American people, but other people of goodwill who understood that the cause was right and just. But her energies, her initial energies, got that ball rolling. And the passage came about as a result of the work that she started.
Beatrice Morrow Cannady died in 1974. It wasn't until 2002 that Oregonians voted to remove the final exclusionary language from the state's original constitution.
And the fact that we don't do that until the 21st century is, I think, an amazing revelation. And it's a reminder of the kind of circumstances that Beatrice Cannady's generation had to deal with. And sometimes victories are not going to be reflected in that generation. It's going to take time before final victories are won.
There's more about Beatrice Morrow Cannady on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Ann and Bill Swindell's Charitable Trust, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and from viewers like you. Thank you.